Love staying informed? Subscribe now and get unlimited access to local news, weather, and sports for just 99 cents a month for your first 3 months at inforum.news/join. Read every story, listen to every podcast, and download the apps that keep you informed and on the go 24 hours a day. So head to inforum.news/join right now to subscribe. What are you waiting for? Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month at inforum.news/join.
Welcome to Plain Talk, and our legislature's in session down in Bismarck, of course, which is what we've been talking about every time you tune into this show. Later in the show, I actually want to talk about them using fake legislative days. This is kind of an interesting thing. Did you know that it doesn't... Everybody talks all the time about how the legislature is constrained by the state constitution no more than 80 days every 2-year cycle. But the thing is it only counts against those 80 days if they gavel in. Right now, they're down in Bismarck, and they can meet and they can have committee hearings and everything, but as long as they don't go to the floor and officially gavel in for a floor session where they actually pass the bills, it doesn't count. And in the past, they would do this maybe once or twice a session. They've done it a half a dozen times already this session, and there's more coming, and, well, that has some interesting implications. We're going to talk about that in the second half, but before we get to that, we're going to be talking about Bison World. It's a project in Jamestown that folks there, it sounds cool. I like the idea of it. But there's a little bit of a fight in the legislature now over funding, over tourism funding, and there's always a debate over, how much should we put into tourism in our state. Now that debate is focused on how much, if any, of that money should be earmarked specifically for Bison World. Joining us, along with my co-host, Ben Hanson, is going to be Brian Lundeen. Brian is a Jamestown resident. He's been a mover and shaker on this. He's a member of the board of Bison World. Brian, talk about your involvement in this project.
Yes. We have a small volunteer board of directors for a nonprofit corporation called the Bison World Fund. We have just completed a 2.5-year planning process at a cost of over $1 million. Trying to get ready to work with the state on a public-private partnership, which is the way this project would have to be done. So we feel we have gone through the getting ready phase, and now we've been talking to the legislature. The governor, is the visionary in the sense of it's time to step up our development of destination attractions in North Dakota. And just this week, Sarah Adi Coleman, our tourism director, said the state is behind the 8 ball. So we feel we've been trying to do our part to develop privately a destination attraction that would fit right into their vision that they've had for some time now.
Let me back it up, Brian. Say I was coming from Fergus Falls, Minnesota, or Bozeman, Montana, looking to take my family somewhere, and I was weighing the usual Midwestern options, or just a little bit west, Yellowstone, the Mount Rushmore, that kind of thing. Can you let folks know what is the history of this? What's the impetus of this? Before we get into the funding legislative piece that Rob and I are going to want to jump on, what is Bison World? Where did the idea come from? How old is this? Because I hadn't heard about this, even though it had around last session, and I'm guessing I'm not the only person reading the story going, what's this now?
Good point, Ben, because back in early 2020, a city councilwoman who had the tourism portfolio asked some of us if we would take a fresh look at our current roadside attraction, that Frontier Village leading up to the world's largest buffalo monument. She said, could you take a fresh look at this thing? She wanted to know if we could grow that attraction into a major regional or even national tourist destination. She said, after all, our city has 60 years invested in the bison theme. And we said, yes, we'd love to help, but only if we bring in Disney level thinking. And we meant that literally, that we really needed people who have done this from Alaska to Egypt,
Mhm.
cultural theme parks. And so she said, let it rip. And that's where we said, okay, we're volunteers, but that's when we brought in Apogee Attractions, considered by many to be the leading designer, developer and operator of theme parks all over the world. So I guess in a sense, we stumbled on it because when Bob McTire of Disney fame, he's the president of Apogee Attractions,
Mhm.
when he came out, he said, you're hitting on the future of the tourism industry here. There are no more Disney Worlds. This is the guy that created the most profitable attraction in Disney history. He said, look, there's no more Disney Worlds or Six Flags to be done. The future of the industry are regional niche tourism destinations. So for instance, built on an animal, the Kentucky Horse Park, in our case, Bison World, Legoland off of a toy, children's TV characters like Sesame Place, the Grizzly and Wolf Discovery Center. He said, this is the future of tourism, especially for the millennials that want these dedicated thematic regional national theme parks. This would be the only bison-centered theme park in the world.
Sure.
And our best analogy has been the Kentucky Horse Park, really.
Sure. So long term, everything went where you're wanting it to go, and we'll get into some of the funding mechanics here in just a bit. But say every domino fell your way, what year would this attraction be open and available to North Dakota and regional families just to go to have a day at? Like, I could buy a ticket and I can go. How long would that take?
Okay, so it's a 2.5 year, up to 3 year building process. So if the state joins us in a public-private partnership, we would be looking at, probably open spring of 2026. Maybe ready before then, but you'd probably open that spring. And Bob McTire, he came out and testified before the Senate Appropriations Committee, and he said, do I need to remind people that in the 4th year, so let's say it takes a full 3 years to build it. In that 4th year, he said, when you say North Dakota outside the state, do people understand that they'll say, isn't that the home of Bison World or the, Teddy Roosevelt Library? We will have some flagship destinations that define your state. No different than Kentucky. You say Kentucky Derby, Louisville Slugger Museum, Kentucky Horse Park. So it gives your state identity. It elevates your profile way up when you decide to do a destination attraction.
All the music halls in Nashville kind of thing. Yeah.
There you go.
One thing that really gives me, when I hear about this project, that gives me some confidence in it is the fact that we're already kind of doing something like this. We have Medora. Medora exists, and in fact exists a lot farther from major population centers like a Fargo or places like that than Bison World would. Although it's also along I-94. I mean, Medora, I think, is the exact same sort of attraction. Obviously, it's a different sort of attraction from Bison World, but it has a lot of regional appeal. Their thing is a lot very focused on Theodore Roosevelt National Park, so it's a lot of outdoors / theater, musical, and all that kind of stuff. And of course, that's where the Theodore Roosevelt Library is going as well. So we've already done this successfully. What specifically do you need from the legislature to get this done?
Rob, if I could, just on one point, you've hit on a key point that we've been working with the Division of Tourism now on for over 2 years, that we have location. I mean, there's no other interstate exit left in the country where a destination attraction would be within 3 blocks with 8.8 million people going by it every year. The Division of Tourism since most of our tourists are coming from the east, they've known for years that we need to try to pull them off the highway earlier, get them into a destination attraction so we can pitch all things tourism in North Dakota. We call it kind of a barbell strategy. You take Medora and the library, you add a Bison World, and you've got those facilities. You've got the Native American tourist attractions in the state where we've got a place where we can be a tourism gateway for the entire state, get them off the highway earlier, and we can keep them that extra day or two, which means millions in economic impact for our state. The way we're looking at it right now, an $80 million core facility, we feel we're done on our end on the private side. A $40 million range that we feel we put in place, but the outside investment community does require a commitment from the state, show that you are committed to taking to growing your tourism industry and diversifying your economy. Show us, they've seen it all in other states. They need to know if the state is truly committed to taking this industry to a new level.
I mean, that's risk mitigation, right? I mean, that's essentially, they're asking the taxpayers to take up some of the risk of this venture. And I'm not saying that like that's a bad thing.
Not so much. I mean, to them, it's the state ends up with an annuity here. See, we're kind of stuck with this public-private partnership idea, not only for that point, Rob, but you're talking about, we've gone 65 years. This doesn't have, I say this has more to do with President Eisenhower than Jamestown. If he wouldn't have put that exit there through vacant state land,
the freeway system.
You couldn't do this.
Yeah,
land at no cost. It is state land. This is the other thing the investors look at. Well, it is state land, and they've got to want to develop this non-productive state land and finally get something off of it after 65 years.
Let me pose this to you in a way that's an actual question. I think a lot of the critics of a project like this, their argument is, if it's such a great idea, why do they need taxpayers? Why do they need the taxpayers in on this? Why can't they just do it on their own? You say,
well, great question. It's very similar to other things. So for instance, I go back to, if there's no federal grant from Calvin Coolidge to Mount Rushmore, there is no Mount Rushmore. If the state of Minnesota doesn't do a public commitment of $500 million, there is no US Bank Stadium. But take that to our big industries now. No 30 years of government investment in fracking technology, there is no Bakken booth, okay? If there's no state and federal commitment to developing the UAS drone technology, there is no US program at UND. Certain things, outside investors say, is your public committed to this industry? Show us, prove it. We've proven it in the Bakken. We picked up on all that research and developed an oil boom. We've picked up on that research for drone technology, and there is no Northrop Grumman without state and federal commitment to developing the technology. It's very similar in this situation. We may not like it, but the outside investor says, prove it. And I don't care if you're 1927, Calvin Coolidge, if he doesn't do a grant, there is no Mount Rushmore. We have to understand that these public-private partnerships in certain industries, certain situations are required. It doesn't really have as much to do with risk as you think. It has to do with, does the state want to finally benefit after 65 years on a piece of land that the highest and best use of this non-productive state land is tourism. That's why 65 years have gone by and the state has gotten nothing on it, where we're saying, if it's a legislative action versus a state investment board type situation investment, if it's a legislative commitment, you're still talking $4 to $6 million a year in state taxes, in sales and income taxes that flow to the state. No. So after 6-7 years, it turns into an annuity for the state.
So
and it's
Brian,
getting now,
So Brian, that being said, have there been attempts, as and I can't quite remember, you just answered this. When did this project first start up? It was 2020?
2020 was when we were asked to take a look at it, and when we said, only if we bring in the Disney level thinking.
Sure. So has there been any attempts at simply going through private sector funds to see if that with the premise that if this thing is going to work, your returns will be that much your ROI will be that much better given that you got in on the ground floor and you own a larger percentage of this. Has that route been attempted?
Yeah, I mean, we feel that there will be, there's 40 million in place. Once you start talking naming rights, sponsorships, bonds, that's in place. But they do require, is your state committed to growing the tourism industry and diversifying its economy? And they need to know that. The private investor world needs to know that.
So when you say they, you're talking about current investors are saying we are committing with the caveat that we want you to grab, well, frankly, taxpayer money in order for us to, as a contingency on our funds.
Yeah. Well, and they look at it a little bit. Okay, it's a state project on state land. I mean, it is their land.
So we want to make sure they allow it for sure. Yeah.
Well, that doesn't seem to be an issue. But is the state going to develop an economic development engine on its own land with the private sector?
Yeah. Now, are you at liberty to name any of those sponsors right now? Any of the big names?
Not necessarily, although Stifel Financial is out there. The legislative leadership and others know that Stifel Financial has given us a formal letter of support that contingent again. They're in, the state's in, major commitment.
Our legislatures in Bismarck talking about all this stuff, and there was an article by my colleague Jeremy Turley about this, and one of the arguments that they're making, and I'm zeroing in specifically on comments from State Representative Mike Nathies, Republican from Bismarck, and he's saying that essentially the Senate added this, and people you have to realize at this point in the legislative session it's a very fluid situation, so there's stuff getting added and taken away all the time. That's just the point in the legislative process that we're at. The Senate put some money back in to try to facilitate Bison World. Senator Terry Wanzik, who's a Jamestown area lawmaker, he's been kind of the tip of the spear on that. And the response from Nathy was, that essentially they're facilitating stuff for Bison World at the expense of some programs, for instance, in the tech sector. This is a quote from Nathy. He said, quote, "I think it just sends a terrible message both ways. These are long-running successful programs, and now we're going to reduce them all for a theme park." And I thought that was a little specious because money's fungible. There's a lot of different ways the legislature could make funding available for Bison World. It doesn't have to come at the expense. It's just that seems to be the choice that they're making right now. It doesn't have to be that choice. But as you're watching some of that unfold, Brian, what's your reaction? I mean, because on one side, you're telling us you have private sector people who are coming in and saying, we want a show of commitment from the taxpayers, from the state. And meanwhile, our legislature's kicking this around and having a pretty, I don't know what the right word is for. I don't want to say vicious. That's overstating it. But they're having a little bit of a brawl about it. So what is your thinking as you're watching this?
Well, and Rob, you know better than I do, but that's why conference committees exist. We're very confident that they're going to come up with a win-win situation. It's not.
What does that look like? I mean,
it's both.
Because I noticed in the same article, our director of tourism, Sarah Adi Coleman, she's saying that there's not going to be a golden ticket for any project. There's going to be a vetting process for this. Are you looking for a specific commitment from this legislature, or do you just want them to open the door so you can get into that vetting process?
No. I would say we're with the governor. We've got, visionary governor, incredible new legislative leadership, key members. I think they're all committed to, growing this industry. And it doesn't have to come, it's finally making this commitment. And Sarah Adi Coleman's been out there for years talking about the need for this. The stars seem to be lining up that you do have leaders in place that say, let's take our third largest industry and elevate it to a new level. We're very confident that they're going to work everything out. This is about creating making a commitment to destination development, and then we all go in and compete for it. We're not really asking for anything but a chance to compete for a commitment to destination development.
Brian, you've referenced Disney level thinking multiple times, and you also gave a little bit of context for what you're looking towards is not necessarily, Epcot, Disneyland, Disney World, Six Flags are kind of their own markers that are going to kind of exist on their own as institutions, and you're looking at a more regional center. You name checked it was a Kentucky Horse Farm.
Kentucky Horse Park, yeah.
Kentucky Horse Park. Is there precedent with either those blockbuster level areas for Disney World, Disneyland to have gotten taxpayer funds on the state level from either California or Florida at the time? And I realize it was a very different era. We're talking I think it was just post World War II. I actually can't remember.
Well, I feel like some of the incentives for Disney World have been in the headlines recently as well.
Well, but no, but I actually don't want to jump down quite that path, because we're talking about the building of these areas. That is after it's been established and talking about their established. But I think there is an important piece of Brian's narrative here that Disneyland, Disney World didn't exist until they existed. And my understanding, I haven't studied it in detail, but it is fascinating, and I'm guessing, Brian, you have studied it, was that there were a lot of people, even in Florida, who called Walt Disney crazy for wanting to build where he wanted to build in Orlando, because they were like, this is nowhere. You're not by a beach. You're not whatever. Why are you trying to build here? So I'm wondering if there's precedent for either on those blockbuster ones, Six Flags, the Disneys, from getting funds from the state, Florida, California, and those instances. I don't know where all the Six Flags are, or with the horse park, did the state government of Kentucky come in with funds there, and were Kentucky residents pleased by that or not? And I realize I'm asking you, so of course you have emphasis to say they were, but what's the narrative there? What's the precedent there?
Well, we've researched probably 100 of these situations, especially those niche where the future of the industry is going, these niche things. So Kentucky, for instance, they understood this is quite a while ago, that the state would have to do 100% of the cost of construction. Then you would get your Rolexes, absorbing juniors, Alltech. You'd get your private sector would pour in after the public commitment. That's 100%, $130 million to do that in today's dollars if they did it. Many states. And then the Ark Encounter. I don't know if you've seen the Noah's Ark replica theme park. Half of that is state commitment. States getting very creative, like keep all your sales tax in the sales and incomes rebated into the facility. So it's almost in every situation, whether it's, you go back to Disney World where the state is giving the land, for a Disney World, but the state governments are involved in nearly every one of them.
So he got the land for free because he was willing to develop it.
Right.
Okay.
Yep. And he had learned from Disneyland what not to do. He was constrained at Disneyland, so he went to Florida and he formed a bunch of dummy corporations in the area so they wouldn't know it was Walt Disney. As he was getting all this land. But I don't know, it's a long story. But to answer your question, they range from 100% developed by the state to some portion there.
Brian, I realize we probably should have started with this part of the interview, but because this podcast is this podcast, we of course jumped immediately to the nerd stuff. But why don't we talk? We've talked about like Disney level vision. What are we talking about? Because you say Bison World, I don't want people to go away from this with visions of walking up to a fence and seeing a bunch of bison out in the field. Obviously, it's going to be a great deal more than that. So give us a verbal tour, if you will, through what it is exactly you're planning. What does this attraction look like when it's built? Sure.
We've learned, again, from this group of 19, we've had 19 people on this project from Apogee Attractions, and these cover the Disney guys, SeaWorld, Knott's Berry Farm, Universal Studios. That's the team of 19. And they know what the core facility has to have. So our Bison Discovery Center, a very entertaining, interactive facility, from the history of the bison to the future conservation and preservation of the bison, but it's a very entertaining It's our magic kingdom, so to speak. So your Bison Discovery Center is your core, educational, entertaining facility. But you also have a children's zone, especially for these tourists that come in, from a carousel to having, their kids having a 2 or 3 hour burn off the energy area. So a children's zone. You have to have, an amphitheater. You have to have a bison safari. You take them out up close and personal encounters with the bison. I mean, it is our national mammal, thanks to Senator Hoeven. Nobody's ever done anything with that iconic, symbol, building a theme park around it. You've got a bison safari. You've got a zip line tying the new to the old, take you up to the monument with a skyway. You've got zip line. It's not an amusement park. That's something that in the history of these things you grow into, but you start with your entertaining, educational, cultural core. And then there's a restaurant, retail. We've got a Bison Mall. That's where we hope to do our North Dakota Tourism Gateway, our tribal tourism promotions, in addition to, lots of other retail. But you have your 4 or 5 core things that get you your in our case, it's very ultra conservative, a 1.5% penetration rate off of the 21 million visitors to the state each year. And you can even run the traffic pattern model and it comes out the same with the 8.8 million people going by that exit. What's your percentage you get into these facilities? We have to keep in mind, the roadside attraction we have brings in up to 240,000 people each year from every state in the country and 20 foreign countries. It's just the state's not capturing anything off of that. It's not getting anything off of that facility. But anyway, I hope I answered you. You have 4 or 5 core things to get you your 325,000 first year paid attendees. And then, see, they don't really, Apogee looks at this as they look 50 years out. They already know what you grow into over time. When you get your hotel conference center adjacent and so on and so forth, they know where this grows, but they feel they have that core thing to get your 1.5% penetration.
I want to dive back into the legislative process real quick, Brian, because I was kind of surprised when I saw the article and I saw the headline. Now, I'm not out in the legislature every day, but I'm guessing there are a lot of folks around the state, especially who aren't from Stutsman County, that this is the first time they're ever hearing about this. And I could see an immediate distrust being there. Where can you describe how this came about in the legislative process? And I mean, literally, like, where was it added on? Has this appropriation been in the budget since the beginning and we're just hearing about it now due to contention, or was it added on later on? Where was this at? Because this was presented and frankly it did fail the last legislative session.
Well, no, again,
context of it? No?
Well, remember last session, it was only Senator Wanzik at the time wanted to be helpful to our planning process. I mean, we've raised, over $1 million to do this. Well, he was trying to get funding that would help you keep going, finish the planning process. And it kind of got off, people dubbed it an amusement park because they didn't understand what was really being developed. And so it just didn't, it did. So the discussion about Bison World started, 2 years ago or more. And so it wasn't, and we weren't really done. We weren't done with it's been a 2.5 year planning process, so we weren't really done, but now we are done and ready to talk to them. And this has come up through the entire Senate, hearing process from day one. So it's been in this legislature from day one.
From day one, and it's getting headlines now due to contention. And I appreciate that context.
I mean, only now are people writing about it, but it's not like we haven't been meeting with leadership, appropriators, for months. So it's old news. That story was old news, to us. We weren't in that story, as you know. and because it's inside baseball covering what's going to be a conference committee. But
well, it's always at this point in the session, there's a pot of money that's available, and some things are going to end up in the pot, and some things are going to end up not in the pot, and that's what they're fighting over now. And this is one of the things.
Yeah.
And
again, the governor proposed this $50 million destination development fund in his first address.
Yeah, and the governor's obviously passionate about that. I know he's very passionate about the Theodore Roosevelt. He took a very special interest in that, the library, and obviously I think this is the sort of thing. Not to speak for him, but this is the sort of thing I think that's very much on his mind. Brian, I thank you so much for coming on. You promised us 30 minutes, and we got it, so I appreciate it.
Brian, where can people go to learn more about this? I assume you have a website or something where they could read about the proposal.
Yes, they can just go to the Jamestown Tourism website, and they can get the 100+ page presentation there. DiscoverJamestown.com, I think.
Discover Jamestown. There we go.
All right, sounds good. Thank you,
guys.
Brian.
Hi there, my name is James Wallner. I produce and host the podcast Dakota Spotlight, a true crime podcast that tackles historical and unsolved crimes in the upper Midwest. Follow along with me as we search for a missing girl, attempt to solve a 45-year-old murder, and much, much more. That's Dakota Spotlight Podcast, anywhere you get your podcasts, or at inforum.com/podcasts.
Well, interesting interview, interesting project. I understand why people get queasy sometimes about public-private partnership. Because let's say sometimes, Ben, there is.
I do all the time. There's a lot of developers that pay off government officials to get tax breaks that smaller folks can't get. They can't. They don't have that kind of access because they can't pay for that kind of access.
Some of it's just flat out. It's just flat out rent seeking. But that doesn't mean that all public-private partnerships are a bad idea. And especially something like this, that I think if Bison World is successful, and I'm not sure that I'm smart enough to say whether it will be or won't be, but if it is successful, then that's of obvious public benefit across the region, right? I mean, if we can, off-ramp some of those people who are traveling through our state anyway in I-94 and get them to spend a little more time in North Dakota and get them to spend a little more money in North Dakota, then that's a good thing for our state.
I think Brian is clearly a serious-minded individual, and the people who are working on this have a great intention if they got the result in mind. Two things I wish, I brought up, like, say you have to look outside of never mind Jamestown, like, let's look outside North Dakota, let's look at the region. I'm, someone in their, say, hypothetically, I'm someone in their 40s living in middle class, living in Mankato, Minnesota, or Bozeman, Montana. I've lived in those respective states my whole life. I had one aunt who lives in Bismarck, though, and she said this Bison World was pretty cool. I was thinking about taking the kids to Mount Rushmore. I've got 2 or 3 kids. They're not teenagers yet. We want to make some family memories. What makes me choose Bison World versus Mount Rushmore? And I'll be terribly honest with you, Rob. I didn't quite hear what the wow factor was that's going to draw me, the regional audience, in there. Now, that's going to be word of mouth. It's going to be, I know all about Wisconsin Dells, not because of advertisements, but because college friends of mine told me to go to Wisconsin Dells, so I went when I was in college.
I wonder, because that's such a subjective thing, though. And I wonder what, to me, it really sounded like they want targets of opportunity, right? Like, they're saying that I-94 already has however many million people driving by that exit anyway, right? So how many of them could stop and spend the day at Bison World, right? I mean, maybe that's how it starts, right? Maybe that's how it begins. It's not going to start as Mount Rushmore, but could it become Mount Rushmore? I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't know how, especially for the day, that hypothetical argument doesn't necessarily work for me, because if you're driving from the Twin Cities to Montana or vice versa, you don't got a day to stop. Oh, there's something on the side of the road. I don't care. I'm going.
Yeah. I mean, maybe yes, maybe no. I don't know. I mean, I think with something like this, it's like, why, again, I mean, are we being the people who are naysayers about Medora, saying, oh, who would ever go to Medora instead of Mount Rushmore, right? Well, maybe people who are interested in musicals and not looking at big faces of stone. I don't know.
And finding out just how tiny those presidential faces are at Mount Rushmore, as everyone who goes there does find out.
It's a lot smaller than it is in your imagination if you've never seen them. All right.
It's because Cary Grant all convinced us they were going to be huge because we thought we were going to climb all over them.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah. Let's move on. Let's talk about fake legislative days, because I think this is really interesting. Yesterday, if you watch the legislature, a normal day, when you get it towards the end of the session, a lot of times they'll start the day with a floor session, and then they'll have like multiple floor sessions throughout the day. Yesterday, they didn't have any floor sessions at all. And
why don't? Yeah.
And the reason for that is if they don't gavel in for a floor session, then it doesn't count against their 80-day limit. Now, everybody still gets paid, and the taxpayers, we obviously still have to pay for the legislative staff and the security and everybody else that has to be at the Capitol when the legislature's in session. That cost is, last cycle, 2021, according to Legislative Council, that cost was $80,000 a day when they're in session. If you spread out the cost over the whole interim, it was like $54,000.
Which I'll say, relative to other states, relative to the amount of humans that are there doing the work, is not obscene.
It's not an obscene amount of money when you're talking about.
But your point is,
my point is, this legislature can't get their work done, and they're having to resort to this, which was not used in my 20 years of writing about the legislature. I can remember them doing this maybe once or twice a session.
And in my 20 years of wanting to be in office and only getting elected once, it's a little funny self-dig for everybody. But I want to kind of describe when you're going in there what it's like at first. You get there, and frankly, the first week could be more efficient in North Dakota. I can get into why, but it's actually kind of important to your point. Then when you start up, there is committee work in the morning from about 9 a.m. to lunch. Some committees go earlier, some don't. Then you get a lunch hour. Usually it's an hour, sometimes it's even shorter than that. And you're answering emails, you're getting constant bombardment of information while this is happening, pre-committee, post-committee. Then you head to the floor. For the first week or two, there's not much floor session for a reason that if you haven't been there, you might not think of, because bills haven't popped out of committee yet. And then midway through, it becomes a very regular cadence, committee in the morning, floor session to vote on what's popped out. Then the bills cross over from each chamber. But in the last 2 weeks, it gets kind of odd, because if you're not on the appropriations committee, the committee that assigns the money, frankly, you're not doing a lot. Not because you didn't choose to, not because you're not trying to work hard, just because the remainder of the bills are having the money factor hashed out as it needs to be. But if you're in the other committees, if you're doing your job, and most of them do, they're done with their work. So you're kind of sitting around in a firefighter cadence, waiting for the alarm bell to go off to get called out to the floor. Some people are just playing pinochle. Sometimes they're catching up on emails. Sometimes they're probably going to go back, because we have a citizen legislature, to go back to their jobs. But this session's reminding me of 2013, 10 years ago a little bit, because now we have the 80 days in line that you were talking about. We're now, because of I think correctly in your column, assigned focus on hot button cultural issues, a lot of waste of time on the floor debating 21 bills about what the state's regulation is going to be on anyone who identifies as being transgender, and a lot of other hot button social issues that really kind of spun around and haven't gone anywhere.
We had 20-some bills on carbon pipeline, which I realize is not a cultural war issue, but we had book ban bills. We had all these things.
No, that's a good call out. That carbon pipeline issue was one person with an axe to grind against the governor, and so he decided to spin his wheels.
How many hours did we spend in committee?
Senator Magrum
for a bunch of bills that failed, that didn't have the political coalition around them to pass. And again, this gets really hard, because it's not up to Rob Porter, or it's not up to Ben Hanson to decide what bills are important or what bills aren't.
Despite the fact that it should be. Just kidding.
I mean, we disagree, right? I mean, and that's politics, and so our priorities are going to be different. So a bill that I think is stupid, some constituents in another legislative district, they're going to think it's really important. And you know what? It's their process too. So,
and welcome to the messiness of democracy. Absolutely. But the efficiency factor is still real, even with that consideration in mind.
So it bothers me that they're doing this. And it bothers me to the point where I didn't mind them having the ability to do this in the past, because sometimes they just needed to buy themselves some breathing room. And I never felt like it was abused in the past. I did. You did. Okay.
I can get into it.
Well, maybe let's talk about that. I feel like it's being abused now. I mean, 6, and I heard, I mean, they're talking about doing more. I guess I haven't looked at the schedule yet today, but they're talking doing more maybe this week even or next week. I mean, we could end up, if they keep doing this, we could push the legislative session into like mid-May or I mean, at one point when I had done the math, I was like May 5th that I was thinking that they were going to be out. I mean, they could be pushing it into mid-May. I heard somebody saying we're going to be here till June. That's ridiculous, Ben.
So real quick, first, what you're talking about, I don't know if we actually did describe what a cheat day is in the legislature. That's Ben Hanson's term, not a legal term.
I heard people were saying it was fake days, and it's essentially where they don't gavel in.
So because you don't gavel and vote on the floor session, it doesn't count towards the limited number of legislative days you have.
The 80 days that's in the Constitution.
Let's take a look at this from an efficiency standpoint, and let's take a look at this relative to how other states run their state legislatures, because every state is ran incredibly different, almost shockingly differently. We have 80 days for every 2 years. Right now, because of this, we are pushing past the 80-day mark. We had in 2013 as well, where we had a lot of fake days. We had a lot of last-minute debates. And
how many days was it in 2013? I didn't go back, and my memory was
full 80, and we had fake days on top of it.
Well, how many? Well, right. Well, no. Well, 2003. Yeah. Okay. But how many fake days did they use?
3.
Okay. That was my memory.
We went up to 83, and then we tightened it up a little bit. But I remember Scott Kelsch, who had been there for a long time, representative from Fargo, and I just remember because I knew him before I was elected. He was elected in 96, and he left the legislature 18-ish years later, but he was there when I was there. And he referenced that in that session, he stood up and said, first session I was ever here, we gavelled out sine die day 67. And he said, there is nothing stopping us from doing that outside of our own political will and efficiency. And he was dead right. Because I think there are a couple things at factor here. One, I don't really think those fake days should be allowed. I think if you're going to have a day, you need to have a day, because when we're talking about creating efficiencies, never mind a nefarious intent. I don't think Mike LaFleur or Senator Hogue came in.
I had somebody telling me that they're just trying to like get more pay. And I'm telling you,
not.
Most of these lawmakers are not making more money at the legislature than they would in their day jobs.
But look at it like a manufacturing facility. Look at it like frankly, this area. Look at it like any other business. Set up, essentially, in Japanese manufacturing, it's called poka-yokes. Like things that make it foolproof. Set it up so that you can't have those. We are one of 4 states, and I know I've been on this rant before, but it relates directly to this. We're one of 4 states that has every other year session. There are other ones that do things like have a policy year and have a budget year, and they keep the budget year to the non-election year to try and keep the gamesmanship out, and they have the policy year during the election year. We could look at doing something like that. We could look at, oh my God, doing something like South Dakota does, where we have 40 days every year. You know what it would take to do that? Nothing. We have 80 days assigned to the 2 years. We could just do it right now. Right now, we are an egg-based economy. Planting season starts in April most years. It's going to be delayed a little bit this year.
They have the authority
where they could help farm economy by having it in January and February. It'd be a lot easier for employers
to
allow you to have temporary leave for 2 months versus 4 months.
They passed the bill not that long ago where they can call themselves, if they have legislative days remaining, that they can call themselves back into session. They really don't need to do anything. They could recess and everybody go home, leaving 40 days of their 80 days unused or whatever the number is, and then call themselves back in. I'm wondering if there's not something that we could do in the process, too, to triage some of these bills. And I know we like to brag about every bill that gets introduced gets a committee hearing, and every bill gets a floor vote.
I think that's fine. I think if you shore it up to 40, or even you could extend it to 100, make it 50 days a year, and try and gavel out sooner, because that makes your process that much fast. It's a goldfish bowl principle. When the bowl's only that big, you have to do it in 50 days, get it done.
Well, that's my problem.
It makes you more reactive and more dexterous if you're meeting every year.
Or maybe we just make it illegal to do this. Maybe just make it you can't do fake days. Like you
absolutely.
Because otherwise the restraint's gone. Right? Because supposedly there's a constitutional restraint, except there's a big giant loophole where if the legislature's all down in Bismarck, if they just don't gavel in, they can be there. I mean, really, they could be there indefinitely. They could be, if they really wanted to abuse it, they could be there forever. As long as they didn't gavel in 80 days.
It would never happen because people have jobs and lives they have to go to. But your point is it literally can. And look at how long it took for us to explain all of that. You needed the system to be transparent enough that a regular citizen who has a job, kids to take care of, a lawn to mow, everything else, can understand right away, hey, what's going on here? Why are they doing this? What's the extreme circumstance? Because it's not as if we had extreme natural disaster, flood, whatever you want to say, that was keeping them in longer because they had to deal with it, and they had to deal with it right now.
Even
this was a self-inflicted
13,
wound.
even 13, you could say we had the decline of the oil boom, right? Oil prices crashed. So, we can say that there was extenuating and I'm not trying to make excuses for them doing this.
Yeah.
But I just they shouldn't be doing it. And again, I think this is the problem. Is I think it also encourages intransigence, right? Because look at something like the pronouns bill, right, where the bill gets killed and then language from the pronoun gets added right back into another bill. It encourages people from just never giving up. I'm just going to stand and I'm never going to give in and I'm never going to compromise because we don't really have a time limit.
Yeah, keep punching the vending machine until you can get that candy bar to fall, and it's sitting right there. Never mind what the rules are. Never mind what they say. Just keep punching, and that's not a good system. That's not a good motivation to have.
I think we should stop. I have my preferred. First of all, we should make it so that they can't do this when they're in Bismarck. They're all days, whether they gavel in or not. You can't do the fake days anymore. The other thing is, I think some of these bills, I think you ought to be able to make a motion on the floor and just go straight to a floor vote, right? Make a motion to call a bill straight to a floor vote and just kill it. If that's because some of these bills we need it. Some of these bills are so dumb. I don't think we need a committee hearing. I think we can make a motion, just kill the bill, and move on with our lives.
I mean, I don't disagree with you, but then I think there's a lot of folks that would have a lot of disagreements about which bills to do that with, and there is
that's politics, though.
You can't call the question in committee, and you need some self-reflection on it from the voters too. But hey, there's a lot going on right now, and we should cover a few more things. I really want to get into a delayed. So
Emily O'Brien's bill.
Speaking of latter days. For listeners, there is something called the Delayed Bills Committee. That is a separate committee that allows bills to come in past their due date, which frankly I think was abused in the past. I do not think is being abused here, although you can claim bias that I simply like what's going on. But there is a House Bill 1540 introduced by Emily O'Brien, but co-sponsored by Majority Leader Michael Four, Alicia Mitzcog, Senator Kathy Hogan, Kirk Kroon, Judy Lee in the Senate. So these are big, these are experienced big names that provides and reestablishes a lot of what the governor had initially wanted and a lot of what Health and Human Services had wanted for dollars in childcare. The thing that we say is such a burden to having employers fill in their employment. And I'm just going to read really quickly some of the things they have in there. $22 million appropriated from the general fund for the purpose of investing in child care assistance program to serve more working families. $15 million in the general fund for the purpose of enhanced child care access assistance programs for infant and toddler care. $3 million for the general fund quality tiers in the child care assistance program. There's $1 million in here for the fingerprinting background check issue that we had talked about, where it's getting delayed to the point at the state level where employers therefore can't retain their employees. I'm extremely glad that Representative Emily O'Brien put this in here. I'm extremely glad she took a look at the work, and I had some conversation with her that folks like Senator Hogan had, like the Health and Human Services Committee had, and is reinserting that here because it got stripped out of the Health and Human Services bill. A few things. One, if we say it's a priority, if we go through session and don't do anything about it, was it really a priority? I think the proof's really going to be in the pudding here, to use an old cliche, as to what appropriations does with it. Right now, it's being moved forward, is from what I have heard. Two, I'm seeing this from. I'm really glad she did this because she's taking something that a lot of other people had worked on. But why does it take someone on the appropriations committee at the last minute going through delayed bills committee to work on something that's so bread and butter and so important to everyone from the Chamber of Commerce, on the political sides, from the left to the right? And now there's been an amendment moved to change special funds to general funds throughout the bill. That is passed 8-0 on the subcommittee she's on. And the due pass as amended went out 5-3, and it's going to be going to the full appropriations committee. I'm really glad, and if you care about childcare, please submit your online testimony or contact the appropriations committee. I'm full on advocating here, but it's truly important, and it's so sad that this is getting a gasp at the last minute.
Well, let
session.
me say a couple things about that. First of all, I respect the heck out of Representative Emily O'Brien, and I agree with you. This is a bread and butter issue. It was sad that it was, like you said, in the Human Services bill budget originally got cut out. Representative O'Brien's bringing it back. And to be clear, also, I tried to get Representative O'Brien on the podcast. Unfortunately, she's on the Appropriations Committee, and she's also on a bunch of conference committees, and things are fluid down there. We just couldn't make the scheduling work to record. But
she couldn't fit that in. That's very understandable.
But that's understandable. Not her fault. So I'm glad she's doing this. That being said, are we being hypocrites? Because we just got done talking about a bunch of wasted legislative days and never letting issues go once they've been defeated. This was already amended out of a bill. Are we being hypocrites by saying, oh, but it's okay because we like it, it's okay to drag this back out in a delayed bill?
I think it's a valid point to bring up. I think there is a distinction between fake days and delayed bills. This is bills, and it is a process. I think there needs to be more definition on delayed bills committee, and it is yet again a transparency issue where do citizens really know, do average citizens who don't live and work in the legislature and don't know every acronym under the sun, do they understand what the delayed bills committee is? Because my understanding when I was a legislator, and I stand to be corrected on this and would love to be if it's the case, was the delayed bills committee was originally intended for things like natural disasters. We've done our due diligence. We're going through, and oh my God, there's spring flooding, and Minot's underwater. Oh no, we can't appropriate these funds. Well, that really stinks. We're going to have to be out of session for 2 years for the legislature. Okay, we're going to find a delayed emergency, clause somewhere because clearly these, folks in Minot need this appropriation, and that just makes sense. And that's good faith. I think a lot of the things, and I will name names. I think a lot of Al Carlson used and abused the delayed bills committee to his pleasure when he wanted to, and I thought it stunk. Now that's me, but I'm not alone.
I'm wondering,
and I think there's an ability to do that. I do not think that is what Emily O'Brien's doing here. I think I will say the difference between what she's doing, what Al Carlson was doing, is she's on the record saying, I support this in the beginning, I'm supporting this now, I want to see this come through for the session, versus some of the delayed bills that Al Carlson put in were not in the original session and then popped up at the time. And I think there is a distinction there, but does the average citizen understand or know what in the world's going on there?
I think there's a distinction to be made, because sometimes if we don't like the way a process is going, we want to change the rules of the process, but there's two components there, right? There's the process and all the rules and everything that regulate it, and then there's the people who engage in the process. And sometimes the problem is the process and the rules. Sometimes the problem is the people. And I think in this legislative session, a lot of the problem is we have people in Bismarck who have the wrong priorities. I think we have people in Bismarck who have forgotten what the concept of public they seem to think that public service means titillating legislation, right? And by that I mean entertaining legislation that's ripped from infotainment, from cable news or whatever. We've talked about it so much. The culture war bills, they think that's public service.
And they do it for clicks and online notoriety versus the real life results of how it's going to impact people. Right. And I hope to God they have to encounter people that are directly impacted or harmed by the bills they were trying to get clicks from, and the people who were ignored. And
now there's people listening into this though who are going to disagree, and they're going to say there's a war and we're just trying to protect our children, and that's the appropriate role of government. And I don't know what to say about that. We just disagree. But I think part of the problem that we are addressing, and again, I do think the fake days should go away, but part of what we're addressing here is there is a priority problem in Bismarck, and that starts with the people who are currently in Bismarck and not necessarily the process. Because this same process, as you were saying, Representative Kelch was talking about, this same process produced legislative sessions that ended after 60-some days.
So how do we magically do that in the 90s? And you can say North Dakota is a different state now,
much smaller population. We didn't have the oil play. I mean, there's a lot going on in North Dakota now. We've been one of the fastest growing states in the nation pretty consistently. We've become one of the youngest states in the nation. That creates some things. By the way, I mean, people talk.
I don't think those things inherently create a longer legislative session.
I think they can, though. I mean, for instance, I think really fascinating. If you shift to a younger demographic, you know what you get with that? More crime. Crime is disproportionately, unfortunately, I mean, the fortunate reality is younger people commit far more crime than the elderly. That's just reality. We could talk about why that is, but if your state gets younger, you're going to get more crime. That's just how it goes in our state. So anyway, there's been a lot of issues, But again, I think the problem here, Ben, isn't so much process. I think and although you and I have talked about some tweaks we'd like to see to the process, I really think the problem in Bismarck's people. And I think
you convinced me, actually. No, I was coming in saying we need to we shore up these things, but you are right. It does take the prioritization. It does take who is sitting in those driver's seats and intentionality behind them. I can't let it go without saying we have 2 freshman leaders. They're freshmen as leaders in the House and the Senate. I am wondering and hoping they will come back with a more efficient process and maybe crack the whip a little bit harder next time to produce a little bit better result. I'd love us to take a look at innovating the way every other year is old and busted.
A part of the problem that's looming here too is term limits are on our horizon. What do we do with this process where eventually nobody in the legislature is going to have been there longer than a few? I mean, you're going to have legislative leaders who have exactly 2 terms under their belt. I mean, that's how it's going to have to be.
They're running the show now. They don't necessarily know. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you get less shenanigans with the delayed bills committee. I truly have no idea. That sounds like a nightmare. 8. Well, is it technically 16 years from now because they have 8 now and they have whatever. But
everybody. I mean, everybody now who is there now can't be there, or at least can't be in the chamber they're in 8 years.
Yeah.
So, maybe some of the House is going to move to the Senate and vice versa, but you're going to be running pretty short on legislative experience here starting in about 8 years.
Yeah, absolutely. So, listen, I wanted to leave it off with this. The full Appropriations Committee walked through the bill with Representative O'Brien this morning, and the amendment was moved as a due pass as amended, 16 to 2 with 5 not apparently present or voting, which I'm confused by. What that translates to into human is that it's going with a due pass. And what I have a real problem with when we start legislative sessions with, a lot of times the chambers of commerce, maybe the governor, whether it be Burgum or somebody else, says, North Dakota's got a real issue. We got a real problem here. We got a real whichever. It includes incumbents will say, oh, we've got, workforce issues or childcare issues. And especially when they're incumbents, I'm always sitting there going, well, what'd you do about it?
Yeah.
You were in office. What are you doing?
Well, we came into this
Emily
session.
O'Brien's bill stands out to me because she has an actual appropriation in it. Not that money is the only way to solve a problem, but when you're looking at this, it was about funding, and we're actually putting something towards it. We're actually doing something about this instead of saying, well, let's do a study and look at it in 2 years, which means they don't actually prioritize enough to do it, like we did with the drug pricing bill this time, like we did with a lot of other things. I'm glad to see real action being taken here. I hope the full bodies will take it up. Yeah,
well, that's the problem. We came into this session talking about a child care process and then spend most of our time punching each other in the face over pronouns. So
what a waste.
I don't know. What a waste. That's right. We're going to wrap it up there. Thanks, Ben, and we'll talk again. Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.